a bit casual because back in the 60s in Europe, in France, in the context of Renaissance and the trend of tapestry after the Second World War, it was a very famous topic, and it was very encouraged by the French government and the French culture after the war. There is an interesting figure, that's Jean Lursat. He's an appointed director of the Swiss gallery, the Albusson workshops, and inventor of the method of numbered cartons. He had always also invented a method that was called the numbered cartons, and that takes us to the history of tapestry. Tapestry, ever since it was introduced from the 15th century, the Renaissance, it was subordinate art to the painting, meaning that the most famous painters were painters that were working at the time, but then the weavers were the artisans that actually translated those paintings into tapestry. So the painting and the tapestries are obviously different arts, but at some point during the evolution of the painting, it was very complicated for weavers to translate paintings into tapestries, and this is some of the problems that Goya, for example, had with some of his workers at the time. So to finish with this situation, there was they invented a method that is the numbered cartons. And there was a painter that decides to place numbers at the size of the carton, so that the weaver lacks autonomy, because the only thing that he has to do is to follow the instructions. And there was actually an association of cartoonist painters at the time. Apart from innovating with these methods, the manufacturing of tapestries, Lursat actually met with a bunch of Swiss artists and founded in June 1961 the International Seminar for Antique and Modern Tapestry, CITAM, in the headquarters of the Swiss city of Lausanne. Initially, France had been considered as the headquarters of CITAM, but Switzerland was chosen because of its status as a neutral country, something that was important in the times of Cold War, and they finally got financing from the city, funding from the city as well. And one of the CITAM's first decisions was actually to organize a biennial to show the state of tapestry in different countries. An organizing committee was established, a number of national committees were appointed, there were some rules to which the works exhibited had to comply with. The first biennial was held in 1962, and in it, the participants were 59 artists from 17 different countries, and the requirements were a very big size, a large size. It was 12 square meters. Since Lursat's conception was that the tapestry was indissolubly linked to modern architecture, and its fundamental feature was monumentality, so that the works could not be copies of paintings but original creations that have to be woven in a high or low warp loom, like a pictorial tapestry, and it had to be woven in a traditional way. In this first biennial, there were 6 different Polish artists, 5 of them women, and their pieces of art are very striking because they move away from the tradition. Especially innovative were the works of Magdalena Abacanovich. She would be one of the leaders of this movement. And what's it sadly, because they use coarse and dyed and spun vegetable fibers. This we can see in the picture. And it's being enlarged because it's the loom that they were actually working on. And they are woven with vegetable fibers by hand and dyed, no colors, so that the interest goes into the material rather than the painting, the colors. If the goal of the founders was actually to celebrate the tapestries, what they actually achieved in this first biennial was the other way around, because there were a number of countries, mainly from the East Europe, but also from the United States, that worked in a different way. And little by little, these artists, most of them women, were getting more and more fame, and they were actually forcing things to be done differently. The second biennial took place in the year 1965, because 1964 was a Swiss national celebration, and the rules were changed so that the required size was reduced from 12 to 8 square meters. Other techniques were also admitted, like other forms of weaving and embroidery, and other materials that weren't wool materials, other materials other than wool. In the year 1965, another artist participated, a very famous one, Jagoda Wig, Croatian. And it was also the year of the first Spanish participation. Aurelia Muñoz and Grau Garriga, both from the Sant Cugat School. And there is also a strong controversy and a conflict with the French cartoonist painters, because the press release was new tapestry techniques at the second Lausanne Biennale, and it was written by a Swiss critic, André Quency, a defender of Eastern innovation, which was interpreted as an insult both by Lursart himself and by the cartoonist painters, because he said in the press release that we had to adapt to the new trends, to the innovation, and so it was taken as a very big offense by the artists that were there at the time. Finally, or in the end, they didn't boycott the Biennale, because they were thinking about boycotting the Biennale, but it didn't happen. Although from this time, there are some sentences that were written that, if we see them from the 2022 perspective, were very incorrect, because they were saying that feminist tapestries, for example, could no way be compared with the glorious tradition of the gobelins, for example, or the traditional tapestries. And Quency goes against the little girls who knitted, as he used to call them. Obviously, this is very politically frowned upon. This is very politically incorrect nowadays. At the 1967, the system was changed, and they decided to establish for the Biennale an international jury instead of national committees. The minimum size requirement was again lowered to 5 square meters, and in an attempt to appease the French cardboard painters, were decided to be created in a special section for works done in embroidery. And they decided experimental techniques to be exhibited separately from works that were done in traditional techniques, and obviously the cardboard painters refused to submit to the jury's choice and did not participate. The problem was solved actually by exhibiting traditional tapestries on loan from the French Mobilier National. But in the year 69, the Biennale admitted three-dimensional works. Although this was kind of a controversy, and like I say, the problem with the requirement of being separated was solved by exhibiting in the French Mobilier National. And like I was saying, in the year 69, the Biennale admitted three-dimensional works. Magdalena Abanovich presented her Abacan, a round sculpture made in vibrant red. I don't know if it was this, but it was very similar. She presents, and they were saying that it's a round piece, so to speak. The critics did not know how to take this, how to name it, and they actually called the piece Abacan, which comes from Magdalena's surname, which was Abakanovich. And Arthur L.C. Jock was a Swiss artist, and she also made some flat structures that were independent of the wall and hung them from the ceiling, establishing a dialogue with the interior and exterior space of her pieces. In the case of Jock, her pieces were not completely woven and left the warmth visible, which meant a clear break with the classic tapestry in which the warp was hidden by the weft. This is another Bakanovich piece of art. She was very awarded at the time, and finally, in the 80s, she abandoned textile and started working with other materials. She actually did a workshop in Madrid, I remember, because she did not select any artist from the textile world because she was frustrated as the materials that she was using were not considered to be artistic. There are materials that are for fine arts and materials that are not, and they decided that textile wasn't. This is a piece by Jagoda Buick. She actually uses different types of knots and vegetable fibers, and they are very important works. And Sheila Hicks is another, Sheila Hicks from the United States. She was influenced by pre-Columbine textures. She lives in Paris ever since the 60s. She still lives there. This is an exhibition in Seville in 2019 in which there were some pre-Columbine art pieces of work in the Chilean Museum. And here is the fourth artist, Olga de Amaral. She's from Colombia, and she has a retrospective that's very interesting. And her works are in a museum, I don't remember where, in the United States. So all these pieces of work are actually separated. Well, on the one hand, working in a loom actually delimited the size of the pieces, and also high warp or low warp works had different results. So it's a bit tricky because some of the results might be a bit rigid. And also the loom has got very strong connotations linked to utilitarian art and artisan world, so that these artists are actually working to some more primitive techniques, and they use pre-Columbine textures that are very important at this period. This is another one of the contributions from Aurelia Muñoz. She's the Spanish artist that exhibited the most at the time, and also Grau Garriga from the Sant Cugat School as well, from Spain. And see, Jock wasn't the first artist that worked with this technique, because in the 60s, Leonard Tony had also traveled this road from loom to weaving with warps. And in 1967, she exhibits in the American Craft Museum in New York. Her first exhibition was called Woven Forms. This is a museum devoted to craftsmanship. It was actually the first exhibition in the United States devoted to the theme of experimentation with the formal properties of textiles. Then it was a solo exhibition by Tony, but then later she was joined by other artists like Alice Adams, Sheila Hicks, Dorian Sakai, and Claire Seisler. And then there is another exhibition organized by in 1964 in Caracas in the Museum of Applied Arts, and in which artists that work with the textile, like Alice, with artists that were not considered to be textile, like Hicks, Seisler, or Tony. There is a very interesting study, I don't remember where, but this is a work by Alice Adams. This was a sculpture exhibition. It was a minimalist, although it was more like an organic minimalism, because she used material that she would come across on the street when she was walking by. And there is a very interesting piece of art by her, because she was actually exhibited in the circuits, in the art places where a lot of the very well-known artists of the time that I don't remember the name were actually exhibiting in the same place. But artists like Klaas Oldenburg, for example, when it comes to textile, Robert Morris was actually took textile materials, and in the end he placed the material on the floor, and gravity force was actually working their way. So he used to call this anti-forms, because he let the gravity work his materials. Eva Hess is also an artist that worked sensitive textile materials. She died very young, unfortunately, but she didn't have any problem when exhibiting her works in art galleries, and she was in the art establishment, so to speak, at the time. Another artist of this era is Claire Seisler, Kei Sekimaki from the United States, with a Japanese origin. She intertwined several silk tissues at the time. Ed Rosbach was also participating in the Biennale. He was a professor in Berlin, and he's very important as a teacher, not only as an artist, but also as a teacher. Most of these people don't have a particular technique, but they were trying or experimenting with different techniques, or for example, basketing techniques that were attributed to women at the time, but they were using materials that would come across, for example, cardboard, bricks, and so on. In the 70s, feminist art was reflected by the textile art. The textile art was associated to the feminine, but this is an artist that comes from the feminist movement, the feminist art, Miriam Shapiro, with Anatomy of a Kimono. Miriam Shapiro actually comes from Pattern of Decoration, which is a group that reivindicated the decorative, because decoration has traditionally been associated to women, traditionally. Sometimes I become an activist, sorry, because I feel very passionate about this. The most important feminist art of the time is from Louis Chicago. This piece of work is made from the at the year 74 in California. It's exhibited in the Brooklyn Museum. It's kind of like a banquet table, and it's called the dinner party. And it's a homage to a group of women for their achievements. It was done by volunteer women. The only name when it comes to authorship that appeared in the art is Chicago's name. It's not the volunteer's name. In the Biennale, there were a lot of Japanese artists, and little by little, there were artists that participated in the Biennale, and there were more and more Japanese from a Japanese origin, but also from a United States origin. In the Biennale, we can also see Francois Grosjean. This is by Leonore Tony. She's been working on this ever since the 70s, the 60s. And the last Biennale, because there are 16 Biennales, the last one was in 1995 because Los Angeles withdraws the financial support at the time. But the last one is very interesting in the way it was curated, because there were all these artists were from the visual arts, and they were participating in this Biennale. This is the 14th Biennale that took place in 1989. Biennales were very important when it comes to recognition, the consolidation of the textile arts. It was called the new tapestry or fiber art. But Biennale played a very important role in this, because they contributed with a showcase of the last tendencies and the last techniques and the experimenting works. But if the goal for Biennales was to commissionate or to curate the art, we can say that it was a failure. There is a very famous sentence that says that the art of the textile art was a closed road for the contemporary art, a dead end, so to speak. After those years, actually, there weren't important exhibitions in the textile art, so they were the last exhibitions of the important textile art. We can also see afterwards Annette Messenger in the year 2000, 2004, they are like alternative circles, so to speak. And we arrived to the contemporary art. During the second half of this century, there is a revival of the contemporary art. In the contemporary arts, the context is very important. It plays a crucial role because how it's made, why it was made, the gender, the racial, the background, ethical, social movements, because they want to talk about issues that we all worry about, immigration, feminism, things like that. So that materials, the textile materials, are very well selected because it's loaded with so much meaning. So in that sense, is very used by a number of young artists that are not very worried about previous categories, but they use a textile material from a non-textile perspective, so to speak. And this is reflected in a number of exhibitions of art, of contemporary art, that were reflecting the work of some innovative artists that did not have the recognition that they deserved back then. One of the most important ones is in Boston, the one that we are seeing in the picture, the year 69. Another feature that I didn't mention before is that you could combine in different facilities, in different installations, the art. We talked about biennales before. Ever since the beginning, they were very important, but it's only from the year 2017 where all of a sudden there is an eclosion, there is a revival of the textile art. Teresa Lancela, for example, is a Spanish artist that was exhibiting in Venezia. We can also see Ernesto Neto. He uses kind of like walls hanging from the installations. Also, we have David Medalla. We also realized that there are some artists that don't live in Europe or in the United States or in Japan because they're artists that we know less. For example, David Medalla is from the Philippines. He was based in New York and he exhibited in 2017 this piece of art that was interactive with the audience. Also, we have here in the Documenta Castle 2016, Ibrahim Mahaba. He uses sacks from the markets that he buys in his country, in his home country, and he assembles buildings, and he covers or folds the buildings around Europe, from different cities around Europe. And he uses volunteers from the local cities where he works, and these volunteers work with him because for them it has a lot of meaning. We also have Cecilia Vicuña. She's a painter and she lives from New York and Santiago de Chile. She's in exile, actually. She had to be in exile at such a moment. And she uses textile artifacts from the time of the Incas, because the Incas use artifacts to register dates and to register events, so that she took this idea and she used ropes that hangs from the ceiling to register this tradition. We also have Annie Albers. This is in the MoMA in New York. There are textile pieces of work hanging from the ceiling, taking Renaissance, taking the thread to walk, which is a sentence from the teacher that used to tell his students, take the line for a walk. So that she says, take the thread for a walk. And she doing a pun or a play on words in relation to the professor that I talked to you about before. And this is the Abacam that I was talking to you before about, Magdalena Abacanovic. It was called the Abacam because it was an abbreviation from her surname. So we also had some books, some critic literature, like this book that collects over 100 artists, and at the same time this alternative circle in which they exhibited some textile art that was trying to be integrated into the art circle by inviting artists to participate, textile artists. This is the art triennale in Hangzhou in 2019, and this is Simon Callery using oil. And in the same triennale, we have another participatory or interactive piece of art. This is a Peruvian artist, a textile biennale celebrated in Portugal, and integrates painting and texture. I don't know if Karmel has talked about this in his book, Kilt Afro. This is an Afro-American kilt. I actually read, I don't remember the name, but I read that this is the most important thing that has happened in the 20th century. I don't know if this is a bit exaggerated. I didn't write it, but I have read. This is actually a kilt that was elaborated by Afro-American women that lived in the Mississippi, in Alabama. They were very poor, and they started working in the 40s in this, and although nowadays they still work. There are poor people that don't have an artistic background. These were textiles that were used to register the textures that were used for clothing. And these women do so many interesting works back then, and now we have them in museums, in collections. A lot of people collect them, actually. When it comes to gender issues, this is one of the Cuban artists. It's called War of Peace. This is Joana Vasconcelos. She's Portuguese, and she used knitting in her techniques. It's a very mistreated technique traditionally. But at the same time, textile art uses everything we have. For example, Leah Cook, that uses manual art to wave in a very slow way, warps and wefts. We also have craftivism, that, so to speak, which means that a bunch of women get together to knit together, and then they put the knitting to do patchwork, and they use it to cover urban mobiliary. For example, stands or trees or lamps, they say that they do so to cheer up cities, and I think it's a very pretty idea. And I would like to end with two examples. These old categories of arts are actually being diffuminated or disseminated through pragmatism, because most of these artists do both art and craftsmanship. This is a French author, Simone Felpin. In the 13th Biennale of Lausanne, she took this work in 1987, and also she does this piece, and she was actually finalist in Lovecraft Prize, which is a very prestigious award. Also another Spanish artist, Mercedes Vicente. She elaborates this with tissue that resembles a shell, and she has a very, actually this International Biennale of Textile Arts, contemporary textile art had a very strict requirement. And last but not least, Freddie Robbins. She's British. a British artist,
and
she tries to de-dramatize some of these intense discussions in which I have participated so many times. Thank you so much for your attention.